So now that we know how to export and share our artboards, let's take a look at how we can take the final product and break it apart into assets for the developers. So the first thing you need to do is make some decisions. You need to decide what the assets are going to be, how it's going to break apart. Now, typically, each graphic element that could possibly change in appearance is going to be its own separate asset. So for instance, this back arrow might light up or change colors or do something when it's tapped on. With that said, I may need to design two different versions of it, but most importantly, that means that it's going to be its own asset, and this menu bar back here, just the blue bar by itself, is going to be its own asset, and then this button over here on the right is going to be its own, etc., etc. Where it gets a little more ambiguous is whether or not down here I'm going to create an asset for the icon on top of the fast forward button, and then separately for the shape that's behind the fast forward icon, or if I'm going to make them one asset. It is essentially one button, so I might decide to do that. And these are all decisions that are going to be case by case. These aren't decisions that I'm asking you to make right now. So with that said, once those decisions are made, you can start selecting the objects and grouping together the objects that belong together. So for instance, I will select both of these to group them into one button. I'll do Command G to group them together. And now if I head over to my layers list, I can go to this group, and with this group selected, I can go to the very bottom of the inspector and say that I would like to make it exportable. And by default, it's going to be a PNG file, and it's going to be at its existing size. Now that I've done that for the left or rewind button, I'm going to do it for the right fast forward button, Command G, and I'm going to make it exportable. And you'll notice it's putting this little symbol next to it that shows that it is sliced for export. And previously, in older versions of Sketch, we had to use these separate things called slices to create the areas that we wanted to export. And we had to put slices in the groups, and it got really crazy. So now, individual objects and individual groups can automatically be sliced out for us. It's really cool. It's a feature that is new in Sketch 3. Now, if you're not sure what you've already sliced and what you haven't already sliced, there are these filters at the bottom that come in handy. And if you turn off layers and you leave on the slices, then you can see a list of only the things that you've sliced that are ready for export. And that can come in handy if you're trying to remember what you've already sliced and what you haven't. Just keep in mind that if you have that turned on, you can't select things. I've done this on accident quite a few times, and I'll think that Sketch is broken, I'll think my computer's broken, and I'll be ready to throw something, but it's completely my fault. So just don't forget about these buttons down here. Make sure that they're both highlighted if you're trying to work and select things. So now that we've got a couple of simple things ready to export, it's really a rinse and repeat process. We're going to be selecting more things and making those things exportable. I want to talk quickly about slices though, because slices still exist in Sketch, and I'm going to move over to the side of our document to do that. Before we do just that, I want to point out that you can export multiple versions of the same asset. So if you're creating an app for normal displays and for Retina displays, you may have to do that for each asset as you go along. So let's talk about slices real quick. I'm going to go over to the side here, away from my document, and I'm going to create a circle. I'll tap O, and I'll drag out a circle here for myself, and I'm going to give it a border. I'm going to give it an outer border. I'm going to make that border green. Let's just make that green, like a bluish green. There we go. And as far as the position of that border goes, I'm going to make it an outside border. And let's say that this is normally, oops, that was an accident. Let's say that this is normally filled with a darker color like this. And let's say that this is a button. We'll just say hypothetically that this is a button. Now this might be a state for when that button is selected. And let me duplicate it. And let's say without a border is its normal state. So when I click on it, it turns bordered like this to show that it's been clicked on. And that this is just hypothetical again. Now the problem is if it gets a border when it's selected, that means it's larger when it's selected. That means the assets are not going to be the same size. If you select these and export them the way that they are, you're going to have a problem with your developer. Your developer is going to say, hey, these two assets are two different sizes. So when the state changes, they're not necessarily going to line up anymore because they're probably going to be top left aligned. And if they're off by 11 pixels because of that border, then you're going to see it jump down and to the right by 11 pixels, and it's not going to be a good thing. So This is why we have slices. This is one of the reasons that we have slices. I'll show you the second reason in a moment. But the way a slice is going to bail us out is by selecting the slice tool. I'm going to go to Insert and choose Slice. We can click on the shape, and you'll notice that the slice that it's created goes all the way around the shape, including the border. Now, this slice is the right size, guaranteed. It did it automatically when I clicked on the shape, so that's really cool. And now, if I'm looking to create two states for this, I could go and I can drag this and I could line it up right on top. That's one way to do it. I'm actually going to do it that way to make sure that they're perfectly lined up with one another. And then you'll notice here that I've got a slice on top of these two objects. So what that's going to do is it's going to export what it looks like underneath the slice. Which might sound a little confusing, but since these are on top of one another, they appear as a stack and they get exported as a stack. I don't actually want that. What I want to do is I want to duplicate the slice. I'm going to hold Option and drag it down on my layers list, so I have two of them. And I'm going to group one slice with one oval, and I'm going to group the other slice with the other oval. And now what that's doing is it's giving me the opportunity to select the slice, and then over on the inspector, I could choose to export only the contents of the group that it's in. And you can see the thumbnail on the inspector updating to show that this must be the one that's grouped together with the non-bordered circle. And you can also see in the thumbnail that the slice is accounting for the discrepancy when that border's not there. See how I have that extra space? Now that's the whole point of this slice. I wouldn't have that extra space if I didn't create the slice. This would be tightened up against the circle, and then my assets would not be the same size. So that export group contents only is really important when you have things overlapping, and usually I do have assets overlapping to make sure they line up visually perfectly and to make sure that my export matches that same visual pixel perfection that I've created. You'll notice also if you do want to trim the transparent pixels here, let's say you dragged a slice around something and you were kind of loose about it, you could click this button here, it automatically trims away the transparent pixels and gives you the same result that you'd get if you were slicing out that shape as a shape instead of using a slice at all. But we don't use that so much anymore because when we want to export something trimmed down, we can just select the object and make it exportable. Now, the other reason that you might want to use a slice is if you're not exporting a whole group, but you just want to export the way things look, just based on the way things look. So what I mean by that is if I tap S to get back to the slice tool and I click and drag around this, it's going to export this. If I'm sloppy and I go down and I overlap this button halfway, then that's what it's going to export. It's almost like creating a crop box. You're creating a crop box to export a cropped portion of something. I can click and drag that out and over, and I can export half of one artboard and half of another artboard. I can just stretch it amongst several artboards, and I can really do whatever I want. It's essentially like taking a screenshot, except Sketch is going to do it automatically based on wherever I drag it. And again, you can trim transparent pixels, and if you make a mistake or if you go wide, then it'll automatically trim that up for you. So that honestly is a good reason to use the Trim Transparent Pixels option. You give it a name, and when you go to export your assets, this will become one of the assets that you have to choose from. So you could theoretically throw a slice around all of your artboards and export them together as one image, sort of like a storyboard. So that's another reason to use slices right there. But the biggest takeaway is that you can select a group or select an object and make it exportable. You can select whatever the heck you want using the slice tool, and you can also use the slice tool to correct for a discrepancy if the size of something changes when that object is interacted with from the developer's perspective. Then when that's all ready to rock, you can click on Export. You get a list of all your assets. You can select them and choose Export. You can select all of them if you want to. By default, the ones that are checked are the ones that are selected when you click Export. So for instance, I currently have this slice highlighted, and this slice is the only thing that's selected. Now, it's not too late. I could just check Export All. They all get highlighted, and it knows to leave my artboards alone, which is really nice. Leaves the artboards alone because if I were trying to export an artboard, I probably would have selected the artboard itself. So it knows to favor assets over artboards until you click it again. If you click Export All again, it selects the artboards as well. So it doesn't look like it, but there are actually 3 things that you're toggling between here, not just on or off. It's on, off, or really everything on. And then you hit Export, and you can put things in a folder and give them to the developers. So now, the folder thing. Are they all going to go in one folder? Well, they could. The developers will probably hate you if you give them a folder with 1,000 assets in it. So there is a trick, of course, and this is the last trick I'll leave you guys with. Let's cancel this. In the name of the asset that you're looking to export, let me get rid of this slice, and we'll say that we're exporting this button here. Now, this button here is called Rewind Circle. Let me actually revise the name to buttons/rewind. Now, what that's going to do is create a folder called buttons, and it's going to create an asset inside that folder called rewind. Now, here, I'll do buttons/fast forward. Now I'm going to select both of these and I'll choose export. I'll export these to my desktop, and when I do so, let's take a look at the result. We've got a folder called buttons automatically, and inside that folder called buttons, we've got our 2 assets. Now if we did this for all of our assets and gave an appropriate name followed by a slash, then we'd be able to create all of our folders in Sketch before we really create anything. And then when we export, it takes care of it for us. So if you go back and re-export your assets, you don't have to reorganize anything. Developers will think that you're an organizational maniac unless they use Sketch themselves, and then they'll pretty much just expect it. And with that said, you gotta do it. You gotta keep your assets organized, because people are starting to learn that it is that easy, and you want to make sure you're not out of the loop on that or looking lazy. So you guys have done it. You've taken your app to completion, you've learned how to export assets, and you're now ready to spit out all the bits and pieces for a developer to put back together. Congratulations. If you're proud of what you've done and glad for what you've learned, please leave me some feedback. I would love to hear it. And thank you again for being part of my course.